The wind moved like an old memory across the clearing, stirring the copper leaves that lay scattered around the lonely shack. Autumn had turned the world into a quiet painting, gold draped over brown, stillness stitched between the branches. And in the middle of it all lived a woman the town had forgotten long before the season arrived. Li Mei stepped out into the chilled air with a basket of firewood balanced against her hip. Her movements held the careful grace of someone who survived by wasting nothing, not even a breath. A stray lock of black hair drifted over her cheek, and she tucked it away with the same tenderness she rarely offered herself. Her husband had been gone for 5 years, and in that time the world had folded in on her, pressing her into a small corner where no one bothered to look. She kept her home clean, her words softer than needed, her presence nearly invisible. Loneliness was no stranger here. It sat with her during long nights when the moon rested on the horizon like a pale witness, and it followed her through each slow morning as she stitched worn clothes for ranch hands who never remembered her face. The shack itself leaned slightly, as though weary from standing alone for too long. Its wood bore the touch of storms, summers, and the weight of silence. Yet Li Mei cared for it with a devotion no one understood. It was the last thread of belonging she had. Her fire kept the stove alive, her small hands warmed its cold corners, and her voice, when she dared speak, was soft enough to keep the ghosts away. She stepped onto the small porch, breathing in the scent of smoke and damp leaves. It was the only greeting she expected today, perhaps this week. Very few souls walked this way unless they had business they didn't want seen. The land around her stretched wide and untamed, dotted with cottonwoods that held onto their fading leaves like secrets. A narrow trail wound toward town, but dust rarely rose from it anymore. People had their own paths, and none of them led to Li Mei. Today, however, a new sound entered the stillness, the rhythm of hooves on hard soil. Her heart gave a small, unbidden jolt. She set the basket down and stepped back, arranged herself like someone bracing for a blow she had taken before. The rider came into view a moment later, wearing the badge that had always made her stomach sink. Deputy Silas Boone reined in his horse with the kind of authority that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with pride. His eyes were sharp, not with thought, but with judgment. Dust coated the bottom of his duster, and his jaw was set in a way that promised no kindness. He looked down at her, as though she were something misplaced in a world he controlled. He barely greeted her. Instead, he told her the county was reorganizing land again, and her little shack sat on property the town wanted to clear. He said it plainly, as if her life were just another weed to pull. Li Mei listened quietly, hands folded before her. She answered gently, asking where she should go. Silas shrugged, almost amused by the question. Somewhere else. Anywhere else. This land wasn't meant for someone like her. Those words had been spoken to her before, in whispers, in stares, in the silence of doors closed a little too quickly. Yet hearing them again carved another invisible mark across her heart. When he left, she remained on the porch, staring at the path that swallowed him. A few leaves skittered around her feet like frightened animals. Her breath shook once before settling back into resignation. She had learned long ago that the world rarely softened for those who lived on its edges. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time felt different in places where loneliness settled deeply. She returned to her chores, sweeping the porch, stacking the wood, feeding the small fire that warmed her kitchen. Her hands moved the way they always did, calm, careful, keeping rhythm with the quiet. It was then she heard another horse, the sound gentler this time. She turned slowly, half expecting Silas again, but the figure that approached was entirely different. Taller. Broader. A presence that filled the clearing without trying. Marcus Hartwell guided his horse along the trail like a man who respected the land beneath him. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing arms used to work, not authority. His gaze, steady and deep, moved across the clearing before settling on her. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her lift the last log from the basket and place it near the steps. There was no pity in his eyes, no cold dismissal. Only recognition, as though he noticed the strength in her silence, the endurance in her stillness. Li Mei nodded politely. He returned the gesture with the faintest tilt of his head before riding on. But something about his passing left the air changed, as if the world had drawn a deeper breath. She followed him with her eyes until he disappeared between the trees. A strange warmth flickered inside her, uncertain, fragile, dangerous. She pushed it away quickly. Men like Marcus Hartwell lived in another world, one carved from respect and responsibility. Men like him did not look twice at women like her. Still, she felt the echo of his presence linger, settling into the corners of the shack like an unexpected comfort. For a moment she imagined what it might feel like to live without fear of the next knock, the next order, the next reminder that she did not belong. The thought bloomed too brightly, and she extinguished it before it burned her. The afternoon dimmed, clouds gathering like secrets across the sky. Li Mei sat by the small window, sewing a worn shirt that needed 3 kinds of thread to hold together. She tried to focus on each stitch, but her mind kept drifting to the path Marcus had taken. Her heart beat with a soft, restless ache she didn't recognize. Then the wind changed. She stood and stepped onto the porch just as a faint silhouette emerged through the trees. A horse. A shadow. A man returning. Her breath caught. And in that fragile moment, she understood something she hadn't dared to name. This was not coincidence. It was the beginning of a storm that had finally found her. Marcus Hartwell did not return to the ranch with the same calm he had left it with. The autumn road stretched before him in a long rust-colored ribbon, yet his thoughts refused to follow its path. They lingered instead on the woman in the clearing, the one whose silence spoke in ways most voices never managed. He rode with the weight of something unspoken pressing in his chest, though he could not yet shape it into words. The air held the scent of wood smoke, and the low sun brushed his shoulders in fading gold as he crossed the open fields toward home. His mother noticed his shift before he even dismounted. Mrs. Hartwell rocked gently on the porch, her shawl draped around her thin shoulders like a second autumn. She watched him with those knowing eyes that had once seen through storms, heartbreaks, and the long quiet years that followed his father's death. Marcus tied his horse and climbed the steps, but she caught his sleeve before he could walk past. "You look like something followed you home," she murmured without speaking the words aloud. Mothers rarely needed sound to question their sons. Marcus offered a brief nod, then stepped inside as if retreating from the conversation he wasn't ready to have. Yet even as he tried to busy himself with small tasks, stacking harnesses, checking the lantern oil, the image of Li Mei kept returning. The fragile way she held her posture steady. The quiet in her eyes that wasn't emptiness but survival. The loneliness clinging to her like a long winter that refused to thaw. A man like him had no business thinking about a woman who lived miles from town in a shack barely standing. But the thought continued anyway. By morning, clouds had thickened over the sky, dimming the world with the gray melancholy that autumn sometimes wore. Marcus saddled his horse again, though he told no one why. He told himself it was curiosity, concern, maybe duty. Anything but what it truly was. An instinct that pulled him toward the clearing like a thread wrapped tight around the ribs. Li Mei was tending to her small garden when he arrived. Frost had touched the edges of the leaves overnight, leaving them curled with the first bite of the coming cold. She knelt among them with a tenderness reserved for things on the brink of losing their place in the world. She did not hear Marcus approach at first, not until his shadow stretched across the ground. She startled slightly, then rose to her feet, dusting her palms against her skirt. Her eyes met his briefly before slipping away like a bird wary of being caught. He dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her further. There was something delicate in the air, some fragile space between them he didn't want to disturb. He asked about her woodpile, the stove, the roof. Simple questions, small concerns hidden beneath them like roots beneath earth. She answered each one softly, her voice drifting like the rustle of dry leaves. Yet nothing she said touched the truth, that she knew why he was here, even if he did not say it. The tension in the clearing hummed like a thin wire pulled tight. Then Silas Boone arrived. His horse trotted up with the swagger of a man who believed the land bent to him. His glare cut through the air before he spoke, already accusing, already possessive of the authority he wore. He looked from Marcus to Li Mei as though the sight offended him. He informed them, in that cold clipped tone, that the county meeting had advanced. The land reclaiming would proceed sooner. If Li Mei didn't leave voluntarily, she would be removed. The words fell like stones, each one heavier than the last. Li Mei didn't react outwardly. Her face held the stillness of deep water that refuses to reveal the storm beneath. Marcus, however, felt a heat rise in him, slow, steady, dangerous. He stepped forward, placing himself even slightly between her and Silas. It was not a declaration, but it was not nothing. Silas's smirk told him he noticed. He added, almost with relish, that the townsfolk were whispering about Marcus's visits to the shack. Folk had opinions. Folk didn't like what they didn't understand. The insult wasn't in the words but the intent. Silas wanted her to feel ashamed. He wanted Marcus to step back. Neither happened. Marcus spoke then, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight of a man who rarely needed to raise it. He asked Silas why the land mattered so suddenly, why after years of ignoring her shack, the county felt compelled to uproot one quiet woman. Silas dodged the question with a shrug and a damaging smile. Once he rode off, leaving behind a smear of tension, Li Mei let out the faintest breath, so soft it could have been the wind. She thanked Marcus without lifting her gaze. The gratitude was fragile, almost painful, as though she feared even that would invite judgment. Marcus didn't ask for thanks. Instead, he repaired the fence she'd been too tired to fix, chopped wood she could barely lift, and placed it neatly by the porch. He didn't tell her she deserved better. Words rarely meant as much as actions. He simply offered help the way sunlight offered warmth, without demand. As he worked, Li Mei watched from the doorway, unsure whether to step out or retreat inside. Her heart felt unsteady. People had helped her before, but always with strings, always with eyes waiting for repayment she could not give. But Marcus's presence felt different, less like a demand and more like shelter carved from silence. When he finished, he stood still for a long moment, looking at the shack, then at her. His expression held something unreadable, concern perhaps, but also a question he didn't voice. The wind brushed past them, tugging at her sleeve, stirring the space between them with a restless kind of longing neither knew how to name. She whispered that Silas would return. Marcus answered that he knew. The simplicity of his words frightened her more than Silas's threats. His certainty meant involvement. And involvement meant danger. For him, not her. She could carry her own suffering. She had learned how. But she could not bear the thought of someone else carrying weight meant for her shoulders alone. As Marcus turned to leave, the clouds thickened, swallowing the sun entirely. A storm was gathering over the horizon, not of rain, but of something far more human. Li Mei watched him ride away, her heart trembling like a lantern flame in the wind. For the first time in years, she felt the shift of something inevitable, something she could neither escape nor understand. And somewhere deep in the quietest chamber of her soul, she realized a truth that frightened her far more than Silas Boone ever had. She was no longer alone in her struggle. And that meant everything was about to change. The storm that gathered over Li Mei's world did not arrive with thunder or rain. It came in the form of whispers drifting through the saloon, drifting into the ears of a man who rarely listened to gossip, but always heard danger in the way a room shifted when cruelty was near. Marcus Hartwell stepped through the swinging doors with the dusk still clinging to his coat, and every man inside turned to look at him, as though the wind itself had entered. He didn't visit town often, and when he did, he preferred silence. But tonight his presence carried an edge. He stood at the bar, the wooden counter scarred by years of fists, bottles, and regret. The barkeep poured him coffee instead of whiskey, knowing Marcus didn't drink. The men nearby muttered about harvest, weather, cattle, but beneath it ran a thread he recognized. The town had found someone new to push. Someone easy. Someone quiet. Her name slipped through the room like a leaf tugged by wind. Li Mei. Marcus turned slightly, enough to catch the conversation that Silas Boone fed to the ranch hands, each word dipped in ridicule. Silas spoke of her, as though she were nothing more than a burden the county was finally shaking off. He claimed she had no right to remain on that land, no standing, no husband to speak for her, no family to shield her. And then he smirked, tilting his voice toward a darker corner of mockery. Folks had noticed Marcus's visits. Folks had questions. They wanted to know why a man like him wasted time on a woman who lived like a ghost. The handle of Marcus's cup creaked under the pressure of his grip. Calm moved through him slowly, like a river beginning to freeze. Still, but with sharp edges hidden beneath. He turned from the counter and crossed the room in 3 long strides. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused midair. Silas saw him and straightened, but he did not step back. The 2 men stood under the dim lantern glow, quiet as a duel before dawn. Marcus didn't shout. The saloon had enough noise without adding his voice. Instead he asked a simple question. Why was the county in such a hurry to tear down a shack that had bothered nobody for years? Silas laughed under his breath, but it didn't reach his eyes. He claimed change was needed, progress was coming, boundaries had shifted. He said the land wasn't meant for her. She wasn't meant for the town. And perhaps she shouldn't be meant for Marcus either. The smirk he added to the end of that sentence was a mistake. Marcus stepped closer, the air tightening between them. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only Silas and the men nearest could hear. He warned Silas to keep his mouth off her name, to leave her in peace, to remember that the world didn't belong to men who barked loudest. A hush fell. Silas swallowed whatever retort he had prepared. It stuck somewhere in his throat, heavy and uncomfortable. He muttered something about Marcus making trouble where none existed, but the words collapsed under the weight of his own unease. Marcus left the saloon without touching his drink. The sun had almost vanished, leaving only a ribbon of pink along the horizon. His horse shifted beneath him, as though sensing the heaviness he carried. He mounted and rode fast, wind tearing at his coat, thoughts spinning like tumbleweed across the open land. By the time he reached Lemay's clearing, the world had settled into blue dusk. Lantern light glowed through the shack window, softer than a candle inside a dream. It warmed the air around it, promising gentleness, promising truth. Lemay stood near the doorway, gathering a thin stack of mended shirts. She looked up as Marcus approached, her breath catching in the space between heartbeat and fear. She sensed the shift in him immediately, the tension in his shoulders, the quiet storm behind his eyes. He dismounted, stepping toward her with a hesitation she didn't expect. He told her what he had heard in town, each word slower than the last, each one revealing the shape of danger approaching. She listened without flinching. She had lived too long in the shadows of other people's decisions to be surprised by another one looming. But when he mentioned Silas's smirk, when he repeated how the deputy spoke her name with dirt on his tongue, she lowered her gaze sharply, as if the shame had been meant for her, and not for the men who flung it. She whispered that she had done nothing wrong. Marcus told her he knew. The sky darkened further as they stood together on the small porch. The wind rustled the leaves above them, scattering autumn across their feet. Marcus asked if she truly had no family, no one who might help her fight for the land. She shook her head slowly. Her husband's relatives hadn't wanted her even when he lived. After he died, they pretended she was a story forgotten in an old drawer. Her voice trembled only once, and she caught it quickly, as though afraid he might mistake strength for weakness. Marcus, however, saw only resilience, quiet, steady, and deeper than most men could ever hold. She told him she had survived this long by staying out of trouble, by working hard, by remaining gentle even when the world had been anything but gentle to her. Then she said something he did not expect. She feared more for him than for herself. He asked why. Because, she said softly, good men get hurt when they try to defend people the world already decided to forget. The words hit him with the force of something true enough to bruise. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her toward the small cabin, the fragile walls, the cracked window frame, the garden struggling against cold. None of it would withstand what was coming. And neither would she. Not alone. The lantern inside flickered. Shadows danced along the edge of the doorframe, stretching like hands reaching for something just out of reach. Marcus stepped closer, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He told her plainly, she could not remain here. Not with Silas circling like a hawk, not with the town sharpening their reasons to push her out, not with winter creeping toward a roof that barely held. Her breath tightened, lips parted but silent. She understood. She feared it. She knew the truth carried a price, she wasn't sure she had the right to ask him to pay. But Marcus was not asking permission. He was offering protection the way a storm offers warning, a promise woven into thunder. He looked directly into her eyes, No distance left, no silence to shield her from what he was about to say. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply final. "Pack what you need," he said quietly. "Before the week is over, you're coming with me." The wind stilled for a moment, as if the whole clearing held its breath. And Li Mei felt something shift inside her, a mixture of fear, hope, and the first tremor of a life she never imagined she might be allowed to step into. Something had begun, irreversible as autumn falling into winter. Dawn rose slowly across the Hartwell ranch, its light spreading like a pale quilt over the hills. The air held the crisp bite of autumn, the kind that hinted at winter's quiet footstep approaching. Marcus returned with Li Mei before the sun had fully climbed the horizon, and for a moment the world seemed to pause as the two stood at the edge of his land, the beginning of something neither fully understood, yet both felt in the marrow of their bones. Li Mei stepped down from the wagon carefully, her small bundle of belongings tucked beneath her arm. She had packed lightly, not because she lacked need, but because life had taught her that too much could be taken away. Marcus watched her with a quiet protectiveness, his presence steady and unspoken. The ranch spread wide around them, its fences stretching towards sage-brushed pastures, the barn glowing bronze beneath the rising sun. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, promising warmth she had nearly forgotten existed. Mrs. Hartwell emerged from the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her silver hair pinned in its usual neat bun. Her eyes softened when she saw Li Mei, and without hesitation she stepped forward, taking the young woman's hands in her own weathered ones. There was no judgment, no question, only welcome glowing from an old soul who had seen too much grief to deny kindness when it crossed her path. "You must be cold," her eyes seemed to say without a single word. "Come inside." Li Mei followed her into the house, and the familiarity of a real kitchen, bigger than her whole cabin, made her breath tremble. She moved carefully, as though afraid to disturb anything. The polished wooden table, the hanging copper pans, the herbs drying near the window, they all felt like pieces of a life she had once watched other women live from a distance. Mrs. Hartwell guided her to a chair, and poured tea from a pot that smelled faintly of mint. Marcus remained near the doorway, leaning against the frame as though unsure if entering too soon might be intrusive. But Li Mei was acutely aware of his presence, sensing him with the same instinct one senses shelter before stepping through the storm. The old woman asked gentle questions, nothing prying, nothing that touched the raw years Li Mei carried beneath her ribs. She only asked whether Li Mei preferred her tea sweetened, whether she liked bread warm or toasted, whether she could use sewing needles with thin thread or heavier ones. Questions that said, "I am thinking of you. You are real. You are allowed to exist here." Li Mei answered quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes bloomed with the earliest petals of trust. Over the next hours she worked beside Mrs. Hartwell, helping churn butter, peeling potatoes, and hanging laundry in the soft wind. Her movements regained the rhythm of purpose. She began to inhabit her own skin again instead of shrinking inside it. At times she forgot she was a guest, moving through the rooms with a familiarity she didn't mean to show. At times Marcus watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing how the sunlight softened around her, or how she touched each task with reverence, as if each small act was a tiny prayer whispered into the world. But the day was not only theirs. By noon, word had reached town that she was no longer in her shack. And by afternoon, trouble rode toward the ranch. Li Mei was sweeping the porch when she saw dust rising beyond the fence line, 3 riders approaching. Her hand froze around the handle of the broom, and her breath caught. She didn't need their faces to know who led them. Some men carried a shadow before they arrived, and Silas Boone's shadow always reached too far. Marcus had been repairing the barn door. The moment he noticed the dust trail, he straightened, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked toward the front yard with long, measured steps. He did not grab his rifle. He didn't need to. The strength in his stride alone was warning enough. Mrs. Hartwell stepped onto the porch and placed a gentle hand on Li Mei's arm, guiding her behind her skirts like a mother bird shielding a wounded hatchling. But Li Mei resisted only slightly. She was tired of hiding. Tired of shrinking. Silas reached the gate without dismounting. His smirk was sharper than yesterday, his boots polished with arrogance. The 2 men behind him sat silently, their expressions pulled tight with discomfort or fear, It was impossible to tell which. Silas announced, loudly enough for all to hear, that the county noticed Li Mei's land was empty. He claimed she was avoiding relocation orders. He demanded Marcus hand her over so the issue could be settled legally. His tone dripped with a satisfaction that twisted into something crueler when he glanced past Marcus and saw Li Mei standing in the shadow of the porch. Marcus's jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weighted calm of a man who had once lost something precious and refused to lose again. He told Silas she was under his roof now, that she was safe here, that no one would touch her, not while he breathed. Silas leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing with slow-burning hatred. He warned Marcus he was putting himself against the county, against the law, against the town's judgment. Marcus did not blink. Law did not scare him. Judgment did not move him. And the town had lost its hold on him long ago. But Li Mei heard something beyond the exchanged words. She heard the cost of her presence. She heard the danger swelling like storm water. She stepped forward before Marcus could stop her, her voice trembling but firm. She told Silas she wasn't being held. She came by choice. She told him she had given nothing to the town but hard work, and the town had returned nothing but silence. Silas looked at her like she was dust beneath a boot. He told her she was lucky he hadn't dragged her out sooner. The words froze the air. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling over Silas's horse. There was a stillness in him, a kind carved from the edges of fury. But he did not reach for his weapon or raise his voice. He simply said that Silas would turn around and leave. Now. Silas held his ground for one heartbeat too long. Then he tugged his reins sharply and spat at the dirt. A promise of trouble, a promise of return, carried on the wind. When the riders finally disappeared, the ranch yard fell into a silence that hummed with something new. Fear, relief, gratitude, and an emotion deeper than any of them dared to name. Marcus turned to Li Mei, ready to reassure her, ready to say she did not owe him apology or explanation. But she spoke before he could. She said she knew men like Silas. She knew they did not forget, did not forgive, did not retreat without planning the next strike. Her voice cracked slightly when she added that she didn't want Marcus hurt on her account. She had carried her suffering alone for years. She knew how to bear it. But the idea of anyone else carrying even a portion of it threatened to break something inside her. Marcus stepped closer, the space between them thin as breath. He told her quietly that he was not afraid of Silas, nor of the town, nor of whatever storm followed. He told her that some people live their whole lives without finding something worth protecting. He had no intention of running from the one he found. The words hung between them like the first spark of a fire too large to smother. Then Mrs. Hartwell, sensing the shift, invited Li Mei inside to rest, her tone gentle enough to soften the moment, but wise enough to give it room to deepen. Li Mei walked toward the doorway, but before crossing the threshold she looked back at Marcus. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also something luminous, something budding. Something dangerous. And something hopeful. She stepped inside, and Marcus remained on the porch, looking toward the road Silas had taken, knowing with a steady, unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning. The storm had not passed. It had simply chosen its battleground. Night settled over the Hartwell ranch like a heavy quilt, stitched with wind and quiet. The lamps in the windows glowed softly against the dark, casting warm circles on the porch where Marcus stood watching the long road stretch into shadow. He had been still for a long time, as if listening for something he already sensed approaching. The moon hung low, pale and wide, catching the tension in the air the way cold metal catches breath. Inside, Li Mei sat near the hearth with her hands clasped in her lap, though her fingers trembled as if trying to hold together everything inside her. Mrs. Hartwell dozed in her rocker, the firelight making her face look both ancient and gentle. Every creak of the boards, every stirring of wind outside made Li Mei straighten, unsure whether to fear the night or what it might deliver. Her life had been shaped by leaving, being left, being pushed, being looked past. But tonight felt different, as though the choice before her was no longer between staying invisible or surviving alone. Tonight she felt the weight of belonging tugging at her shoulders, frightening in its unfamiliar warmth. A sudden knock struck the door like a hammer. Li Mei flinched. Marcus stepped inside instantly, his eyes hardening even before he reached the handle. He opened the door with steady resolve, and the lantern light fell across Silas Boone's face, twisted with determination, flushed with anger, sharp with the ugly pride of a man who could not bear to be challenged. Two other men stood behind him, not as bold, not as eager, but present enough to sharpen the threat. Silas didn't bother with politeness. He claimed the county had authorized him to remove Lee tonight. He held up folded papers as if they were a sword. He looked past Marcus to find her, and when he did, his expression flickered with triumph, the kind that made Lee's skin crawl. Marcus didn't move aside. He didn't look at the papers. He didn't entertain the lie in Silas's voice. Instead, he positioned himself fully between Silas and the room behind him, filling the doorway like a barrier no one with sense would try to push through. He told Silas quietly that the county had no jurisdiction over a private home, that Lee was not a stray the town could drag around at will, that she had found shelter under his roof, and that was the end of the matter. Silas's horse snorted behind him, stamping the ground as if echoing its rider's agitation. Silas took one bold step forward, trying to push Marcus back with the weight of entitlement, but Marcus didn't budge. His stillness was more threatening than any raised voice. Lee rose from her chair, unable to stay hidden behind walls while others fought for her right to exist. She came to Marcus's side, careful but determined, her fingers tight around the edge of her sleeve. The firelight behind her made her look both fragile and fierce. Silas's eyes narrowed at the sight of her standing beside Marcus. Something ugly sharpened his voice as he accused her of manipulating him, of twisting Marcus into protecting her, of taking what didn't belong to her. Lee answered softly, but the softness was steel. She said she had asked for nothing. She said she had lived quietly, harmed no one, and endured more cruelty than Silas could understand. She said she was tired of being treated as land to be fenced or dust to be swept away. The men behind Silas shifted uncomfortably. Even they felt the truth in her words. Silas didn't. Truth was not something he cared for. He reached out to grab her arm. He never touched her. Marcus's hand closed around Silas's wrist in one swift motion, stopping it midair. The force of the grip made Silas gasp, the papers falling to the ground like useless feathers. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't bare his teeth, didn't need to. His eyes alone delivered the warning. Cold, unwavering, ancient with a kind of anger he rarely allowed to surface. He said Silas would leave now. That he would not come near her again. That whatever dislike he harbored ended tonight. Silas tried to pull back but couldn't. Marcus released him only when the deputy's bravado cracked into fear. One of the men behind Silas muttered that they had no part in this. They turned their horses before Silas even found his breath. The deputy glared at Marcus one last time, but the fight had drained from him. He mounted clumsily, trembling with rage and humiliation, and rode into the night, swallowed by the darkness he had tried to spread. The silence that followed pulsed with the aftershock of danger, and the echo of something far deeper. Marcus closed the door gently, as though afraid to disturb the fragile atmosphere he and Lee now shared. Mrs. Hartwell opened her eyes, having witnessed enough to know what had unfolded. With a sigh, she excused herself, leaving the room like someone who understood when two hearts needed the space to speak. Marcus turned toward Lee, and for the first time that night his guard lowered. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing weariness, devotion, and something he had kept buried under years of quiet self-restraint. Lee looked up at him, fear dissolving into gratitude, gratitude blooming into something warmer. She reached for words but found only fragments. What came instead was truth, raw and unpolished. She told him he didn't have to save her. She said she couldn't bear the thought of being a burden. She said she didn't want his life tangled in hers unless he truly wished for her to stay. Marcus stepped closer, each movement a confession. He said he hadn't brought her here out of pity or obligation. He said he didn't care about the town's judgment, or Silas's threats, or anything the world threw at them. He said her presence had softened the loneliness that had lived inside him for years. He said he wanted her to stay because she belonged here. Not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone he cherished. The words struck her like a sudden breath after years underwater. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't hide. Her voice trembled as she whispered that staying would be the first choice she made for herself in years. Marcus reached for her hand, holding it like something precious, fragile, irreplaceable. He didn't make promises. He didn't ask for future vows. He simply said, softly but with the certainty of a man who meant every syllable, that whatever storm came next, they would face it together. Outside, the wind hushed as if the night itself paused to listen. And in the warmth of the firelit room, Li Mei realized she was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer bracing for the world's judgment. For the first time in years, she was home,